Anyway, so what I wanted to do is in the first part of this module is really talking about the project environment. Over the last day, we've had these conversations with people like Kevin and so on about the organizational structure, things like lessons learned. We've already mentioned the lessons learned aspect, corporate memory, these types of things. So what I want to try and do with this is just give you another view on what a project is and where it takes place and how perhaps you can define it perhaps in other terms than the ones that you sort of see in the standard books on project management, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick little look at this, and this is really from a network point of view. So this is like taking a systems approach to things, to look at things in terms of networks, and then I'm going to go on and talk about a simple level of work. So I'm going to lay down some tools here to use, some ways of looking at work, and then I'm going to go into the blacksmith shop and I'm going to look at a simple piece of work and how you can use networks to represent work there. Okay? And then we're going to ramp it up from there and go from a simple shop to something like a factory, something which is much larger, production environment, if you like. And then from there to a distributed factory. You know, the stuff again that Kevin was talking about yesterday. If you think, really what he was talking about is it's a factory that's had all its parts moved around different parts of the country, right? And not only that, those different parts are now not owned by the same company. So it's like you've sold off bits of the factory to other people with the intention that perhaps it'll make it more economically viable or efficient or something. All right? And then what I'm going to do, there's a thread that's going to run through this, and it's a little model that we're trialing out at the minute, and a little bit of research that this is published in the literature as well. You can have a look at this separately if you like. But it's called this little sort of Syllk model, which is a way of trying to represent what's going on in an organization and how you can use it to capture lessons from projects in the organization. Right? So let me just show you this. So first of all, a couple of little things to think about. So try to take a systems approach to the organization. So one of the things you'll know, of course, is if you take you imagine a human body, one of the ways that we come to conceptualize what's going on there is a systems approach, right? You know, one of the things we might immediately look at the body and think, well, it's hearts, lungs, and so on, and see them as separate entities, whereas they're actually part of a system. So you've got a skeletal system, you've got a nervous system, you've got a vascular system, you've got a muscular system, and you lay these systems on top of each other, and you've got me, right? Or you. So you've got a larger, the entity is not built of these little parts, it's built of all these systems coexisting with each other. Now the intention of this little model that we've got here is to do the same thing with an organization. So instead of seeing an organization as individual people, bits of equipment and so forth, what you have to try and see it is in terms of systems that are working together. Okay? So some of the systems are the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, you know, the rooms, the environment, factory floor, whatever it is. Right? Then there's the processes that people go through. Then there's the technology that perhaps people use, or the tools that they use. So this stuff is sort of related to not necessarily the people themselves, but to the environment. Right? And then there's other systems. So there's to do with learning. So that's the knowledge of the individual people themselves. What's contained, what skills and abilities I have. There's culture. So these are the various practices, rituals that we'll go through. You know, project managers do different things to accountants. Right? They use different language, different terms. And then there's the social aspect of it, of how we relate to each other. So some of the things there would be, they could be the organizational structure, they could be your PD, the way that your job description is put together, what you do, your roles. That you have to report to somebody. And if you put these systems together, if you collapse these systems together, then you have an organization. In the same way as you collapse these systems together, and they work together, and you have a human body. Okay? So, that's the basis of this little model. So what I'm going to do now is just go and have a look at a simple little bit of, some simple ideas about networks, and then we're going to talk about work, and how all this applies. So networks. So you might not necessarily see these as networks. You sort of see there's on some of swallows, right? But what you've got is you've got clones of each other. They're all the same thing, and they've got a set of rules of how they're interacting with each other. And largely with this particular network, it's sight. You know, and they can also sense whether they're touching each other and so on, right? This thing here that was firing up, this is the network of a telephone system firing up in the morning. So it looks like a fire, it's like a bushfire sort of rushing through the country early in the morning. But it's people getting up and calling each other. Well, it's the whole telephone system network connecting up. The one I had firing off there was a cell. So you've actually got biological connections going on. So cells are connected to each other chemically, being physically next to each other. On this one, of course, with the rugby thing, again you've got another network there, right? This is a network. In fact, there are two networks. There's one on one side and one on the other side. So they're a network because they're clones of each other. That is, they're all sticking to the same set of rules. You know, you can only pass one way. They are coupled together because they're screaming and shouting at each other and they can see where each other are. So can you see how they're a network? And there is a set of rules that the network is behaving to, and that's part of the referee's job, is to make sure that they stick to this set of rules. Say again?
To stop using
This was a brilliant game. So you've got two networks intersecting with each other, but the point is that networks are almost everywhere. All you just need is to be able to see them. Okay? So they're either at the biological level, cultural level, mechanical level. Things are coupled together in some sort of way, and that coupling might be direct coupling. So I may be physically connected. They are physically connected or chemically connected together. Or they may be loosely coupled through things like sight and sound and senses. Now, we can represent these in different ways. And classically, when you see the sort of internet network, you sort of see this big sort of cluster like this, right? But if you imagine you went into this network here and you got a hold of the nodes where they all connect, the things themselves. If you got a hold of the nodes and you sort of push them to the side neatly in a circle, right? You'd have this. So all the nodes are being pushed to the side here, but the connections are they're still connected. Can you see that? Now, if you imagine then, perhaps, then let's say some of the highly connected nodes, if you push them to the middle, you get a setup like this. Now imagine you're looking at this network, so you're looking at a bunch of flowers, right? So if I got a bunch of flowers here and the flowers are turned over and facing you, if I then just turn it up on its side, you see another aspect of the network. Can you see that? That's the top of that. Can you see that? That's still a network. Each part of this is still connected to this part over here. It's just in some parts you might have to go down a long way to come back up. But they're still connected. So, just introducing a term here, which is systemic, which is different to systematic. Something which is systematic is one after the next. You systematically do something. But something which is systemic, well, if you went to the shops this afternoon and bought weed killer, you'd find that's one of the words that they use on it. It's a systemic poison or whatever it is, right? And that is, if I inject it here, it will go everywhere. Because everywhere is connected. Okay? Now, so I've got a couple of things on the go here. So first of all, with the bodies type thing I was talking about, there are systems, right? When you see an entity like a human, or you see an entity like an organization, they aren't built up out of individual bits. They're actually built up out of systems that coexist together. And in fact, if you damage one of the systems, it has a knock-on effect to the other one, right? Then we had a quick look at networks, and the intention of looking at that is just to show you that networks appear in all sorts of environments. You just need an eye for being able to identify them. And then we can draw them, the ways we draw them, because you know, they are three-dimensional real things. All we're trying to do is come up with a drawing in a two-dimensional space. It's quite difficult to do it, right? So we could draw it like this, push it apart, bring the nodes together in the middle, turn it on its side, but it's still a network. So what I want to get you to the point is that when you look at something like that, you are seeing a network. Okay, of things connected to other things. Now, so these are the nodes. It's just a closer look for a second. So these are the nodes of the network. And as I just mentioned, they are the sort of the arrows that we draw, all these lines. See, another thing that we do when we look at networks is we look at these arrows and we really think, what we end up focusing on is these things around the side. We end up focusing on the, how can I put this? If I had a pen, I could put it on in a drawing. Okay, so if we have an organizational structure, right, let's do a very basic little network. This is a network. Now, when we look at things like this, we often focus on these boxes. We focus on the nodes in the network. Whereas really, if you're talking about functions like leadership, or trying to enable the system and move it in a particular direction, you shouldn't be concentrating on the nodes. You should be concentrating on the connections and enabling those. Okay? So this is the important. It's the connections. Now you can achieve these in a number of different ways. Formally, in a formal structure, but of course also socially, how you actually enact it out. So one of the ways of mobilizing a network, pushing a network in a particular direction to get a particular set of behaviors, is not to focus on trying to command and control the nodes. It's by influencing how they're connected. Okay. So let me take you to the blacksmith's shop for a second. And let's just have a look at a simple piece of work. So, here's the blacksmith, and he's making nails. Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations book, back in the 1600s, 17 something, he started talking about the nail maker and the division of labour. So what I want to try and show you now is how you can use the stuff about networks to represent the work of making a nail. So there he is, bashing away doing his particular thing. In the environment that he's working in, he's making these because they're building ships just down the road. And they start building more ships, and they want more nails. So he can only make, let's say, 200 nails a day himself. So if he wants to make more, because the market is demanding more, he employs somebody else. Now if he just gets the other guy to copy what he's doing, They can make 400 nails a day. But the trouble is, now we've only got one anvil, we've only got one furnace or forge or whatever they call it. So you've got all this sort of problem in, so what you do is you say, now look, you stay over by the forge, I'll stay over by the anvil, I'll do the first bit, you do the next bit. So we divide the labour. When there was one person, the knowledge of putting that nail together and making that nail was in the one person. And not only in that person, but the knowledge of making that nail is in the equipment around them. It's in the anvil, the shape of the anvil, the hammer, and so forth. Because people, you know, you do this yourself, you tinker around with things. If equipment isn't working in the way, you'll adapt it, right? Or perhaps you'll change the shape of the handle so that you can hold it better. See, the knowledge of doing that job is not only just in your head, but it's pushed into the devices that you're using over the years, right? So the knowledge about making that nail is not only in the person's head or in their skills, but it's also embedded in the tools and the environment they're in. You start taking them out of that environment and putting them in a tent somewhere, and the nail will come out different. Right? Now, if you've got one person, here's the network stuff, think about this. If you've got one person making the nail, the knowledge of making that nail is embedded in the one person and their particular environment. But if you divide the labour, it's now spread across two people and their particular environment. And so on. You've got a whole team of people now making this nail. So, building ships, they want fantastic nails. This nail that you're producing is brilliant. It's better than anybody else's nail. But the interesting thing now is that the knowledge for producing this nail is not in one person. The knowledge for producing this nail is distributed across a group of people and their tools and their equipment and their environment. Do you see that? Because if you just grabbed one of those people and said, make that nail, they couldn't do it. Because this person here has no idea of how to do this person's job or use this piece of equipment. Okay? They become specialized as they've gone on. So what I'm trying to show you here is how knowledge about something, just a simple work task, is distributed across a network because they are all connected. Because they're all driving to creating the nail. Yeah? So, this is how we start building a little bit of a model to represent this. So there's my little nail maker's network there. And I'm going to turn it on its side. So I'm going to turn it on its side and I'm just going to group some stuff here. And basically what I'm saying here is at this point here, this is where the knowledge of making that nail is stored. Across these people, it's across the infrastructure, it's across the processes, it's across the technology and the tools, it's across the culture, the rituals and practices and the values and what they think is important. It's across how they're interacting with each other and the knowledge, the individual knowledge of the people. Okay? So know-how, it's just another way of describing this. Know-how, can you see this little thread here? Know-how of producing this nail, if you wanted to know where the information is, or the knowledge is about producing this nail, it's across this here. It's like this little thread. This is what we call this little silk thread, right? So know-how about producing lots of other things is across here. Now you can disrupt this very easily by taking one of these things out, or you can disrupt it by not enabling it. So in other words, if there was a particular function now for making, let's say there's another device that they're going to make, another type of nail or plug, you can have all the knowledge about it, but perhaps a piece of technology is missing, a tool. You can't make it, because that part of the system isn't functioning. in alignment with the rest of them. Does that make sense? So this is where we get this little diagram from. And the idea is that you've got these little sort of parts of the organization, so we call them learning, culture, social, technology, processes, infrastructure. There's a bit of research that's gone behind this, which one of our researchers, Stephen Duffield, has done to come up with these themes here. So I haven't just plucked these out of the air. But the idea is that the knowledge for doing something is stored across here. Now, think about this. The knowledge for doing a particular project should be stored across each one of these things. Okay? So this is what the lessons learned thing is. If you had a lessons learned activity, that is, let's say it's a debriefing or something, or a way of flagging problems, and you also need people who have the power to make these changes, because it's pointless you just sitting there talking about this. They can go in and make changes to these particular parts, these particular systems, to make sure that they enable that practice to happen. So if you go now a little bit further and then you sort of say, well, a factory, what about a factory? So with a factory, we've got, there's a bunch of people. There they are, all the sort of, could be a big blacksmith's factory or something, but I don't know what he's producing. This one's producing cars, right? So this is Henry Ford's cars, the Ford factory here. Now, think about this. In this factory here, the object that you're producing in this production line is small enough to move. So you can have a factory in one building, and you can move the object around it, which is one of the things that Henry Ford did, and you can produce these cars. You have the people standing still and the cars moving. Now, if you drew the network of this factory, it could look something like this. There's all these people, different parts of the factory, doing different jobs. But of course, they're all connected and all coupled together. They're all handing on the job. They're all coupled through the equipment. They're all coupled through the job itself as it's moving. This is their nail, right? And again, you could then say, you could redraw that in terms of, this is really what the factory is like. Now, the important thing to recognize here is that, in this sense, one person or one company is owning this environment, and therefore one person or one company, or the people there, they can make changes to this. They have the power to do this. So, if there's some sort of learning, if they do need to learn a lesson and make an improvement, then they have the ability to make the changes to these systems to make things go smoothly. It becomes more complicated when others are involved, as we'll see in a minute. So this is our factory floor. So one of the things on the factory floor is, there's the goods coming in, and we have the system of where it goes around here. And we're all connected to the system. Here's the network. This is what the network actually looks like. These are the people. And they couple together through the work that they do and the equipment that they do. And the knowledge of producing those cars is not only embedded in the people, but it's embedded in the floor plan of the factory. You go in there and move the equipment around tomorrow, and it's still going to produce cars like it did. Okay? This, as I was mentioning yesterday, is where things like the Gantt chart comes from. Because the Gantt chart is the drawing of the sequence of work as it unfolds. And if you then want to go and change that on the Gantt chart, see if you go and change that on the Gantt chart, that's really like changing it on the factory floor. It's much easier to move a little thing on the Gantt chart, isn't it, than actually go down on the factory floor and make changes. But that's where the knowledge of this is. So, let's have a think about what a project is. So here's your production environment, where you've got your things working away, producing cars or whatever they are. As soon as you've got a customer that comes along and says, I want something different, I don't want that. I don't want those cars. I want this. I want this car. I want your car with a double axle on it. That's what I want. I want a stretched limo type thing. Same car, but stretched. Right, so now what you've got to do, that's not going to go on the production line. You've got to take it off. You've got to take it off the production line. You've got to tinker with it in some sort of way. Somebody needs to look after it at work. So you may be putting it back on the production line, so you might be dragging on some operational things, but at some point you might have to add new ones. See, this is the nature of project work. It's not only to do with taking things off the production line, it's to do with there is not so much support for that work to be done like there would be for operational work to be done. In other words, that network that I showed you back here, this is set up for the production line. It's not set up for that piece of work with a double axle on it. Right? So what you've got to do is you've got to go back to this and make sure that this does support that double axle piece of work. So a way of characterizing projects, as I've got it here, is here's a production line. They're producing these nuts. Somebody says, I don't want one of them. I want a nut just like that, but I want wings on it. Well, your production line doesn't do that. That's not what it makes. So you've got to take it off. You've got to tinker with it a bit and then put it back on again. You're still using the operational environment, but you're having to use it slightly differently to what normal procedures are. Again, somebody comes in and they want something else. They want even more of that. So it stays off the production line. In other words, it's not using so much of the operational environment as this one was. It's using less. More stuff has to be built in around it to deliver this piece of work. And again, there's even less. To the point now that we have some organizations that don't actually have an operational environment. They just get cobbled together to do project work. How's that sound? Does that sound familiar to the work that you experience? Yeah? And then there's the distributed factory. So now it's more complicated. Now when we have things happening in an environment where we have a legal system, contractual system, an economic system that allows you to think about the factory in bigger terms. So in other words, we're selling off bits of the factory. Also what we've got is the factory moves. Because you can't put that on a conveyor belt. You have to bring the factory to it. So there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, for one person to own this factory is perhaps not economically viable. It's better to keep putting the factory together as and when you need it. So different people own different parts of the factory. You see this when we look at supply chains and so on. Right? You can see a supply chain, it's just a big factory, all connected together, owned by different people. It has to be coordinated, put together, and then it has to be just assembled for the job, and then it all falls apart away. So if you were to look at a network, so instead of it all being the same color now, owned by the same company or the same people, now we've got different people involved here. And you can see in that little movie there, it's like this swarm that assembles around it, right? Now, that's not saying that there's chaos there. You can have a system set up to do that. There's your factory, because we built these before. We do these often. It's not as if we never built things like this before. We've got operational procedures in place. We have to tinker with them a bit. We have to, using the factory term, we have to rejig the whole thing a little bit. But here's the complicated part. That is, what you're doing is when you're putting this together, it's like mashing a whole pile of bodies together to create one bigger one. You're melding the systems from one organization with the systems of another. So now, in the middle of this thing, you created this factory, this distributed virtual factory. And the slices, the systems, are now not wholly owned by you. They are owned by others as well. So when we talk about technology, when we do this, the technology that we're using is not only owned by one person and has the control of changing that, but it's owned by a number of people. So can you see how complicated this becomes? In fact, how complex this becomes. Because it sort of arranges itself as it goes along. What you need, and in terms of the project environment, is somebody, some unit, to be able to stand back and see it like this. Because until you can stand back and see it like this, see, when you look at it like this, you can see that this problem's going to happen. You can see that if we want to do some particular project, we're going to have to make sure that we utilize all these things. We've got the right people, the right systems, the right behavior, the right infrastructure, and so forth, and nothing's blocking it. And the difficult thing is that I don't own all of that. Some of that is owned by other companies in the distributed factory. So that's a way that if you look at systems and networks, this is how you can look at project work. So project work is something that has a lack of operational support by all sorts of measures. Maybe a small amount, maybe a large amount. Do you sort of feel like that when you manage a new project? Yeah? But it doesn't need to be, because you can set the system up. You can set the factory up to run projects. All right? And this is what methodologies are trying to do, but I don't think that they're explicitly seeing it this way, because methodologies aren't affecting these systems. All these methodologies end up doing is affecting perhaps one of the systems, and that's to do with the processes. And there's a whole pile of other stuff that's stopping this from happening. So every project you do, here's how it works, right? Every project you do, along the way, you have a mechanism for reporting problems, reporting blockages, reporting things that are getting in the way of you doing what you need to do. And those things need to be fixed so that next time that we run the system, we don't get a blockage. And it's literally about having a department or a unit or a person, whatever scale this is, that sits back and is able to take those reports and then is also able to pass that on to somebody who has the power to make those changes. And what you are doing then is rewiring the business to enable that project behavior to happen again. So literally, you've got, see, the trouble is if you don't take control of this, it goes out of hand. And this is what we've done really. We've sort of forgotten that, when you're doing what you're doing, we forget that this is a factory. That's what it is. It's a big assembly line. And every time we do a project, it's like trying to recreate an assembly line again. Or trying to cobble one together quickly to get the job done. But what you need is the ability to be able to cobble that production line together. The system needs to be wired to enable you to do that. Unless what happens is, of course, everybody's fighting against the system. So when you're fighting against the system and you're struggling to co-opt people and involve people and get access to stuff and to do things right, what you're doing is you're slamming into a system that's just not enabling you. Yeah? What you do need is somebody that's sitting on the top of that, that's able to take that report and say, okay, that is causing us a problem. We need to change it so that it does enable you. And then that rewires the factory.